So welcome to today's lesson on writing like a human being in this world of ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. And today, Edgar Allan Poe is going to teach us how to write vibe. So let's begin with the question, what do you think a vibe is? So I'm going to read out some of the comments. So why don't you put it in the chat? What do you think vibe means? We've got some answers. The feeling, mood, ambiance, emotion you feel as you read, soul, mood that is set, energy. Getting a lot of people saying energy. The oomph, that's a great word. The tone of voice your audience expects. That's a really good one. Vibration, aura, atmosphere. These are great answers. And the thing with vibe is there's some people who there's a lot of vibe that is uncontrolled and there's vibe that is controlled. So for example, when you show up to an interview wearing professional clothes, you're controlling the vibe of how you present yourself. You're controlling your impression by wearing those professional clothes. Whereas if you show up in sweatpants, if you did it by accident, you're still influencing the vibe with how you're dressed, but you weren't in control of it. So one of the skills of a great writer, an excellent writer, is that he is in control of the vibe that he sets in his writing. And this can be difficult for a lot of new writers to grasp because it's something that you get with practice as you develop your voice. And you should never try to copy someone else's vibe, but you should learn how you are creating your own vibe in your writing. So it's the mood or emotional response that writing creates. Like the musical score over a movie scene can make the same scene look happy, sad, scary, or funny. An excellent writer can command the vibe of his writing. So that's the main overarching topic for today. So today what you'll learn, hopefully you'll come away with 3 learning outcomes, which is 1, to be able to recognize a metaphor and how to deploy it so that it's powerful instead of cringy. 2, you're going to learn what information to leave out of your writing to engage the reader's imagination. And 3, how to appeal to and manipulate the reader's senses to achieve these same goals. First, let's talk about who Edgar Allan Poe was. And his life kind of reflects the character of his writing. He was born in 1809, and he was an American writer from Boston. He's best known for his short stories and poems that focus on the macabre, the dark, the horrific. He kind of invented the horror genre itself. He was a pioneer also of detective fiction and science fiction. He died at the age of 40 under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind an oeuvre of excellent literature we can enjoy today. And he inspired many authors, including Dostoevsky. In 1861, Poe's writing was published in the Russian magazine called Vremya, which means time in Russian, where it galvanized and inspired many Russian writers, including Dostoevsky. And in fact, Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment after reading Edgar Allan Poe because he was so inspired. We can see striking similarities in the quality of their work. So if Dostoevsky can learn something from Poe, we can certainly learn something from him. So, in school, you're usually taught these grammatical and literary devices in such a boring way, and you're never taught how they're applied, well, unless you had a very good teacher. And I love this quote about metaphors. So we have to get this grammatical lesson in order to understand what Poe was doing. So I'm sure you've all heard of the word metaphor, but I want you to think a little bit more about what a metaphor is actually doing. And I love this quote by Sir Roger Scruton on the topic. He says, "Metaphors make connections which are not contained in the fabric of reality, but created by our own associative powers. The important question about a metaphor is not what property it stands for, but what experience it suggests." So that means metaphors are used to make comparisons between 2 things. This is what we're taught in school. But it's not just the direct comparison that's being made. It's what else is being suggested around that comparison. So here's an example of how a metaphor can really charge writing. So the first sentence is, "The woman was in charge of the kitchen. She was very bossy and made others feel inferior." This is very direct writing. It's kind of like out of a textbook. 2, the woman was the tyrannical queen of the kitchen, and the staff her helpless peasants. So the second sentence turns the kitchen itself into a little kingdom because it has a queen and it has peasants, and it turns it into its own little universe. Whereas the first sentence doesn't have any of that overarching vibe around it. It's just telling you a direct quality about the woman. So I want you to take, I'm sure, you're all writers or you're all interested in writing. So I'm sure you can think of many more metaphors. Why don't you type in the chat some metaphors that you've heard very commonly used, and I'll read some of them out. I'll give you a few seconds. You cannot be understood if your writing has all the hallmarks of an Aspie mom. Stupid as a bag of hammers. I love that most insults are all metaphors. The highways and byways of life. Sleep soundly like a baby. So Afshin, I think, has introduced a simile. A simile is a type of metaphor. So metaphors include things like personification, simile, pathetic fallacy. All of these other literary devices are types of metaphors. Oh, this is a great one. It's not your job to drown yourself by trying to keep others afloat who don't want to change. So clearly, when you read this, if you're a native English speaker, you would understand that Siobhan is not talking directly about swimming and drowning. She's talking about greater problems for which swimming and drowning are metaphors. How about this one? Does anyone remember "The City Never Sleeps" or "Time Stops for No One"? So these are also examples of metaphors, but they're a little bit more subtle because we use them so often. So city is, the sleep is being compared to the city's activity, but it's so embedded and enmeshed in this idiom itself that you hardly ever see it anymore. Even the single words can be metaphors. Oh, magic in hands, walls have ears. This will be your cross to bear. That's a great one. So another great thing I like to remind people is that even single words can be metaphors. So, for example, the word Odyssey has become a metaphor because the word Odyssey refers to the ancient Greek text about the journey of Ulysses back home after the Trojan War. And he goes through all of these challenges to get there. And people started comparing so many journeys to an Odyssey that the word came to be defined by its metaphor. And actually, some literary scholars like to argue that every single word is a metaphor. So they're very magical things, and they're things that we should all learn how to use in our writing. Epic, one-word metaphor, great one. So let's learn some of the body parts of a metaphor. It has a topic and a vehicle. So the topic is the subject we want to compare, and the vehicle is the comparison that we use. So, for example, the woman was in charge of the kitchen. The woman was the tyrant of the kitchen. So the word woman is the topic and tyrant is the vehicle, and the staff her helpless peasants. So we have another topic and vehicle here. Can someone you can type in the chat if you know the topic and vehicle for the second half of this sentence. The staff is the topic and the peasants are the vehicle. Great job. Very smart audience. So we're going to be looking at 5 different passages today from Edgar Allan Poe. And now we're a little bit more equipped with our literary language to describe what we're reading. And these 5 passages are listed here. So we're going to be going through this list so you can keep track. They're all from his collection of short stories, which is freely available on the internet. And I encourage everyone to download it if you don't want to buy the hardcover book, but hardcover book is also amazing. Here's the first one. Passage 1 is called The Reveler Upon Opium, and it's from Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, upon the bleak wall, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of the soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping of the veil. So this is the beginning of the short story where the protagonist is pulling up to the house of Usher, and he's sharing his impression of this house. And you can already tell that the mood in the scene has been set. There's something going on that is not quite right with the house. So why is it that we can get this feeling of gloom and horror? Well, of course, he says it in the first sentence. A sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. It's very obvious. But when you say sentences like that, I felt a sense of insufferable gloom, that sentence has to land by giving it some evidence behind it. And that's what is shared in the rest of the passage. So he writes that there are the vacant eye-like windows. So that's another metaphor that he's used here. So the windows are like eyes, but they're vacant eyes. That means that they're the eyes of someone who has died, if not physically, then spiritually. So there's something wrong with the eyes of the house. Upon a few rank sedges and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees. So he's talking about decay. And then when he's talking about decay, because he's already compared the windows to eyes, we can imagine the white trunks are like exposed bone of a corpse. And so all of these things contribute and give evidence to that first sentence about the insufferable gloom. And then the most amazing sentence here is, with an utter depression of the soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after dream of the reveler upon opium. So this was a brilliant comparison, because if you think about it, what is the after dream of a reveler upon opium? So opium is, what heroin used to be called. It's a type of heroin. And he's talking about the feeling of coming down after being high on opium. And that depression is not merely a normal depression. It's a more extreme version because, scientifically speaking, your ability to feel joy is actually numbed because you were so high before. So it's a depression that's deeper than a normal one. And he's found a perfect way to describe that through this metaphor. So that's why metaphors are powerful. They can allow us to describe things that are deeper and more powerful than the ordinary way of saying it would allow. Because how can you say it's a depression deeper than a normal depression? You have to give some kind of visual or sensation that would help the reader to understand what you're talking about. And the word reveler is really interesting too. He doesn't say, drug addict. He says reveler because a reveler is a dreamer. So it's someone who has been living in a dream world and is suddenly pulled from that dream world and is coming to reality. And it's the reality that's very bleak. So this is how Poe has used objective reality so that we don't actually know if the house actually looked like that. It could just be the character's personal perception that has invaded the objective reality, because he's talked about being high on opium. He's talked about his personal biases about the house. And so it's colored the way that he sees it. And this is what Poe's really good at doing. He's good at blurring the lines between what is real in the story and what is created by the perception of the protagonist. So his narrators are notoriously unreliable. And you can, of course, use this in your writing as well. You can choose how much the perception is objective reality and how much it's influenced by you or another character. Here's the next passage. Oh, I'm going to read the chat. Metaphors are such good imagery. He's first setting global vision of the house, and he goes on developing certain details like the windows and trees. Yeah, it's very similar to that. That's a great comment, where you start out with a broad view and then you go into the details to back it up. Let's read the next passage, In Crimson Light. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and so vast at a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through trellised panes and served to render insufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber, or the recesses of the vaulted, fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. This is from the same story, The Fall of the House of Usher. And I'll let you take a moment to just take this scene in and notice the feelings that you get when you walk in. This is a time period when they didn't have movies. And what I love about Edgar Allan Poe's way of doing horror is that he doesn't rely on outright gore like a Hollywood movie does. He relies on, Poe's writing is more like that suspenseful music in a horror scene, where what you're seeing is actually quite ordinary and normal, but the way that he writes it, or the way that the music overlays on that scene, makes it seem horrific, builds suspense, and makes you feel uneasy just because of that overlay of music. And that's why his writing is so powerful, because nothing he describes here is overtly terrifying, and yet the scene is quite terrifying. So let's find out why he's able to do this, what in his writing gives it this power. So first of all, he can build a sense of suffocation. So he writes, the windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and so vast at a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. So he's talking, what he's describing here are windows that are high up from the floor, so you can't actually see through them. You're very tiny in that room. It's like a room built for giants. And they are long and narrow, and even though there's light coming in the room, you can't actually see out of the room. It's like you're in a prison cell or a basement, and they are pointed. So that seems like it shouldn't have any effect, but actually it does, because if they were rounded, it might, the architecture is a little bit softer, but they're pointed kind of like daggers. And that has an emotional effect on how you read it. Someone asked a great question. How do you know if you are doing too much with metaphors, such as describing this room? So there has to be a balance in your writing. Every sentence can't be a metaphor. And you have to also think about what the purpose of your writing is. So if you were to read this entire short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, every sentence was not, or every paragraph didn't look like this. I've just pulled out the ones that have these literary devices used really well. So that's why I encourage you to read the whole short story, because the reason these metaphors are able to stand out and be so powerful is because they're interspaced with other types of writing in between. It's like if I showed you a cathedral and was showing you how it was built very beautifully. The cathedral itself would not stand out or be wonderful if every building in that village or city was also a cathedral. It would have to be interspaced with other types of buildings so that it could stand out. What exactly is a metaphor in this sentence? So in this sentence, it's not really a metaphor, actually. It's just a type of description that makes the reader feel like they're suffocated or trapped in that space. Here is a metaphor if you were looking for one. So the sentence is, feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through trellised panes and served to render insufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. So this is another method of suffocation, but it also includes a metaphor. So the light itself is usually a metaphor for goodness in any kind of writing. But in this case, the light has become feeble. So light is just photons. It's just electromagnetic wavelengths. It can't be feeble, like a person can be feeble or an animal can be feeble. But in this case, it's become, by writing feeble gleams of light, it's as if the goodness itself has been attacked by just trying to enter this house and has no strength. And the word encrimsoned, it's a really great way of saying red. But it's a very different kind of red because it's implying, it creates the implication of blood or some kind of crime. So it's like something violent has been done to this light that's trying to enter this house, that makes it a bad omen for the house itself. So you should never underestimate how the words you choose and the metaphors you use can influence a person's mood and connotation. So that it renders insufficiently distinct the more prominent objects. So the eye struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles. So the eye is trying to see and trying to get its bearings. The protagonist is trying to understand what exactly is in the room, but can't. So it makes the room even more suffocating because you can't fill out all the dark spaces, and anything could be in these dark corners. That's what makes it even more foreboding. I appreciate you guys answering each other's questions about word definitions. Usually when I have a smaller class, it's easier to answer them, but it would be difficult here. And then of course we are manipulating the reader's senses and making them feel things. So here's where Poe does this amazingly well. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. So imagine that Poe is creating the feeling of suffocation and communicating that to the reader, so the reader can empathize with this feeling. What would it feel like if you're breathing in sorrow? I can't imagine that it would be a fresh and clear breath. It would be something like trying to breathe in a polluted room or a room full of smoke. You wouldn't be able to fill your lungs up fully. You'd be always gasping for breath, and that would make you extremely uncomfortable. And the air that hung over the room. So when air is free and light, you can breathe easily, but when it's hanging, for example, if it's extremely humid, you can't breathe it in properly. It's not full of oxygen. So in this way, Poe has made the reader feel suffocated just by describing it in this extremely sensual way. So he's appealed to our senses. And this is why this scene, even though it doesn't contain anything horrific or gory in it, still makes the reader feel the emotion or the vibe of suffocation and bad vibes. That's what he's able to build, bad vibes for this house. And sometimes in his short stories, he uses this for humorous effects. He builds all these bad vibes around a house or a person, and then the protagonist is extremely suspicious throughout, and then it turns out in the end that there was nothing suspicious at all. And at other times, he builds this vibe, and it turns out that the narrator's suspicions were correct, but there's no objective proof for why he should know that, except that he had this bad feeling throughout the story. So that's why it's really fun to read his stories, and you can understand why detective fiction would have come from Edgar Allan Poe. Someone wrote, "It blows my mind how rich this writing is." Yes, blew my mind as well. So we've learned how using descriptions can manipulate the reader's senses, and this can also help to create vibe. So now we're going to look at the power of what is omitted. This is a passage from Edgar Allan Poe's short story called Berenice, and it's about a man who becomes very obsessed with a woman named Berenice, but then something happens to her. He writes, I found myself sitting in the library and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. So interred means buried or put in a coffin. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? So I'll just give you a few seconds to think about this. So something terrible has happened. That's all we know. But what is this suspicion, this mind virus eating at the back of his mind? I'm sure many of us can relate to it when you have a bad feeling and you're sitting there doing nothing. You can't figure out why you have that bad feeling. And that's exactly what Edgar Allan Poe has written. That's his, amazing power as a writer, is that he can capture even those experiences that we think are nothing, that are just completely private and no one else has probably felt the same way, or we feel even a little bit silly talking about them. So here's Robert Schulman's quote from Poe and the Powers of Mind from an article published in 1970. He writes, Poe has real insight into that basically irrational strategy by which the mind attempts to preserve itself from its own forces of madness, disease, and disintegration by rigidly isolating itself and by assuming that the threat is external when in fact it is internal. This poetic mind, ostensibly given over to pleasure and beauty, is actually given over to what it fears most, to those sudden impulses of despair and frenzy from within, which, because of the unbreakably bolted doors, can neither escape nor originate in the outside world. So this Robert Schulman writes about how Poe's protagonists are quite evil, and they're the cause of their own demise in the majority of cases, and how their minds manipulate and create the outside world around them. And this is a very interesting way to describe Poe's characters. They're not, many of them are evil and many of them are unreliable. So let's look at the scene in more detail. The protagonist says, I found myself sitting in the library and again sitting there alone. He says, it seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. So if the Poe had written, I was sitting in the library alone, it would be completely different. If he had just gotten rid of the it seemed and wrote, I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream, how would it change these sentences? What do you think if he'd gotten rid of these blue parts? Some people gave some great answers. The narrator is awake and knows what he's doing. Yeah, so if he was just, I was sitting in the library, it would mean that the narrator's in control. Nabil wrote, these things happened to him as opposed to him acting consciously. He's writing, the character himself doesn't know what's going on, and that adds to the discomfort. Yeah, when you're not in control of your own actions, that's, I think, the most disturbing and uncomfortable thing possible, when you find yourself doing things instead of choosing to do them consciously. It would change the sentence into ownership. Makes me feel like he's the killer. So Richard Meese, you've read the story. I think it's and it's interesting. Maybe you haven't even read the story, but from this one paragraph, you know exactly what happened, but there's absolutely no evidence to tell you about it. It's just from vibe alone. So these are some great answers. So I found myself, and it seemed, takes the ownership away from the protagonist and gives it to an alter ego who is doing horrific things, probably, maybe, we don't know. And that's the power of what's omitted. We don't know who is doing these things to him, who is his alter ego. And then, the confusion continues. I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. So he didn't have to add in that second part. It's kind of redundant. And you're always told, like, don't be redundant in your writing. But this adds so much to this character because you can see in the writing itself, in the structure, he's trying to figure out himself and piece together his own history, which makes it more disturbing and more uncomfortable. It's like he can't remember the things that he has done. And he's constantly consoling himself about it. It's almost like giving him lines like a movie character, rather than just explaining what happened. And then I love this onomatopoeia here. Onomatopoeia is another literary device, and it means words that sound like what they mean. So the buzzing of a bumblebee, that has some onomatopoeia because buzzing sounds like what it means, the sound that a bumblebee makes. So horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. Can you hear the thunder and lightning when you read those words out loud? Terror more terrible. It's like you're in the room and a lightning and thunder has just struck outside the window as he's coming to the realization of what he might have done while he was unconscious and while his alter ego was in charge. And of course, the meaning of the words, the vagueness and the ambiguity, what is left out is where the horror is created, because horror is by definition the unknown, the darkness. The monsters take shape in the places where where our senses don't work, where imagination can conjure them into being more horrible than anything that might exist in the material world. So that's what Poe really understood deeply about horror, and that's why his work was so magnificent. And I think that's why detective fiction and crime mysteries are so interesting as well, because they have these omitted parts to them, these holes in the stories where we can project the monsters that we create in our own minds. Let me check on the messages. It's like he's waking up from a sort of possession. Yeah. Presence of consciousness. Yeah, exactly. The next part. The shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. So it wasn't ringing, seemed to be. So we don't know whether the shriek is real, if it's a memory, or if he's imagining it. So there's all these possibilities that are all omitted. And then he writes, what was it? And then the chamber echoes back to him, what was it? So we don't even know if he said it out loud or if he just thought it. And his surroundings are reading his mind. And that question hangs like an echo at the end of this passage as we try to figure out what it was that he did. And we kind of have an idea of what it was, but we have no proof. He definitely did it. Yeah. So here, what he's done in this scene is he's created the alter ego to increase the suspense. And he's omitted lots of things and these omissions engage our imagination as we try to fill in the gaps of what is missing from these scenes. And engaging your reader is one of the most powerful things that a good writer knows how to do, because no one wants to just be passive when they are reading. They want to engage with the writing and have a conversation. And in fact, that's why reading is often a lot more engaging than just watching a TV show. Watching a TV show can be more relaxing than reading after a long, mentally challenging day, because when you watch TV, your brain doesn't have to do any work. All of the sets, the characters, everything has been already designed and it's right there in front of you. Whereas when you read, you have to engage with the text to imagine what everything looks like and imagine all of the surroundings. And this is what makes reading superior to watching TV in terms of engaging you mentally and developing your mind. So the next passage you're going to look at is suspense and sensuality. So this is a passage from the same short story, Berenice. So we're going to see what happens next. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor, it slipped from my hands. And with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. So, something interesting has happened. What are the ivory-looking substances? What do you think they could be? They're all in the comments. Everybody's got it. What do you think is the benefit of describing them as ivory-looking substances instead of just saying teeth? Why would he not just say that? Poetic, makes them inhuman, engages the reader to think, gets our imagination going. Teeth is not as intimidating. It kind of creates an inside joke. Well, not really a joke. It's like dark joke, but it creates a communication between the writer and the reader. You and I both know what we mean, but we don't really have to write it out on paper like this. So that if a writer can do this, it means he's created such a bond with you as the reader already that he doesn't even need to write things anymore in order to get you to understand what he's saying. Can you imagine how powerful a person needs to be able to do this when they died like 100 years ago? So Poe is not alive. He's not even in front of you. He hasn't been alive for 100 years. And yet the last sentence of this one small passage that you've written, that you've heard from him, he's created this bond with you of an inside joke that he doesn't even need to write to get you to understand what he means. That's called being a powerful writer. And that's, what I aspire to be able to do, that I don't even need to write things out explicitly for my readers to understand what I mean. Weren't there elements of suspense in passage 3 too? Yes, there are elements of everything in every passage. It's really hard to just, pull out single passages that only have one device in them or one strategy in them. I've categorized it in this way so that you can get some idea of the different techniques, but actually he uses every technique everywhere. So you have to be aware of that. And of course, when people are creating art, they're not really compartmentalizing their skills and strategies like this, but we've done it so that we can learn something from him. Someone wrote, ivory is special, rare, and novel, therefore captures stark attention. Yeah, ivory is also something precious. That's a good point. So Poe slowly reveals what horrible thing has happened through the senses of the protagonist, which the narrator experiences vicariously. So first he starts by saying, my garments, they were muddy and clotted with gore. So the word connotation of gore is very different than if he had written blood, because blood could mean anything. It could mean that he was injured, could mean that, it was something innocent that happened. But gore reminds us of horror and something violent that has happened. And my garments, they were muddy and clotted with gore. So you start with the senses of what the protagonist is seeing without any explanation for it. So you start wondering, why are his clothes covered in mud and gore in a violent type of blood? The hand, it was indented with the impress of human nails. So the senses have gone from looking at examining his clothes to examining his hand, which has human nail scratches on it. And he says human nails, instead of just saying there were some scratches on my hand, he says indented with the impress of human nails. So he knows that they're scratches from a human being. At some level, he knows exactly what's going on, but he's in denial about it. And this is what makes it so much scarier. Then he spends more time rather than revealing things right away. So he buries the lead and pulls the reader through. And this is when you might actually experience yourself in a story reading much more quickly, because you want to know what happened. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. How would the whole mood of this scene change if instead of this sentence he'd written, he showed me the spade against the wall? What do you think would change in the sentence, in the vibe of the passage? Way less dramatic, it's organic, dry up the story, sense of confusion would be lost. It would break the tension. right away. It would be like popping a balloon. Vague element would be lost. It's from his perspective exactly how he's living it. Moves the reader's imaginary eyes. I really like that way of saying it, moving the reader's eyes through the scene. So Poe is actually guiding our eyes through this imaginary room that he's created with his language. And by burying the lead and putting the spade at the very end of this sentence, he has made the spade even more important and relevant to the story than it would have been otherwise. Because if it's just, he showed me the spade against the wall, that could be a sentence taken out of a Peter Rabbit book about gardening. But when it's in this first sentence, he directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. So that makes the spade a lot more important and relevant to the story, and makes it seem more ominous, build some tension around it. Why is the spade so important? What has it done? Similar to building sexual tension, it disappears when unsophisticated and too obvious. Exactly. It's a great way of putting it. With a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery intermingled with 32 small white and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro. So he has what has he found? He has found teeth. What has he done? I'd love to hear your guesses if you haven't read the story. What do you think he's done? Pulled them out, took them out from Berenice's mouth. He might have tortured her. Anyway, I'll let you. Took someone's teeth as a souvenir. The fact that the protagonist knows there are 32 teeth exactly is interesting. Yeah, means someone is very obsessed with the teeth. It's like Robert Stendhal wrote, I think in the earlier quote, he said, the protagonist knows exactly what he's done, but he's kind of pushed it into his alter ego so he doesn't have to deal with the fact of his own evil. Killed the girls and took her teeth as a souvenir. Yeah, so you guys are very imaginative, and I hope that this suspense makes you read the short story and download it. It's not very long, but it's very interesting. Did he love Beatrice's teeth when she smiled? I'll let you read the story and find out how he felt about Berenice. So we've done passage 4, unveiling the plot like a crime scene, engaging the reader by making him the detective. That's what Poe does when he's revealing detail by detail through the senses what happens, instead of just revealing it in one go. Maybe she just had bad teeth and he gave her implants. That's a good one. That would be really funny. That would make the short story extremely funny, because you build up all this suspense and this vibe of him being the murderer, and then at the end, when you find out what he actually did, he just gave somebody veneers. That would be hilarious. And the reason it would be really funny is like, part of humor is overturning expectations. You expect someone to say one thing and then they turn it around completely. That's what makes things funny as well. Plot twist. Now we're going to talk about another word we're learning today is negative capability. It's a writer's ability, which Shakespeare possessed so enormously, to accept uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, according to English poet John Keats, who first used the term in 1817 in a letter. Negative capability is about a writer's ability to explore these unknown aspects of life without trying to explain them away. We're going to see that in the last passage. And this last passage is my favorite one from Poe. And we're ending on a bit of a positive note with it. It's called The Shadow Beauty. That's what I called it. And it's a passage from Edgar Allan Poe's story, Ligeia. This is also a horror short story, but it's, imagine if all the dating gurus could teach their clients to write letters like this. We would just solve the marriage crisis very quickly. So I'll just read it. I would in vain attempt to portray the majesty, the quiet ease of her demeanor, or the incomprehensible lightness and elasticity of her footfall. She came and departed as a shadow. I was never made aware of her entrance into my closed study, save by the clear music of her low, sweet voice as she placed her marble hand on my shoulder. In beauty of face, no maiden ever equaled her. It was the radiance of an opium dream, an airy and spirit-lifting vision, more wildly divine than the fantasies which hovered about the slumbering souls of the daughters of Delos. Yet her features were not of that regular mold which we have been falsely taught to worship in the classical labors of the heathen. There is no exquisite beauty, says Bacon, Lord Verulam, speaking truly of all the forms and genera of beauty, without some strangeness in the proportion. For eyes we have no models in the remotely antique. It might have been, too, that in these eyes of my beloved lay the secret to which Lord Verulam alludes. They were, I must believe, far larger than the ordinary eyes of our own race. They were even fuller than the fullest of the gazelle eyes of the tribe of the valley of the Nurjahad. Yet it was only at intervals, in moments of intense excitement, that this peculiarity became more than slightly noticeable in Ligeia. And at such moments was her beauty, in my heated fancy thus it appeared perhaps, the beauty of beings either above or apart from the earth, the beauty of the Houri of the Turk. So this is the protagonist describing his beloved Ligeia. And he describes, it's very different from an ordinary ballad or sonnet that is extolling the virtues of the female beauty. So the normal way of describing female beauty is the traditional way is the Petrarchan sonnet. And it's so common, in fact, even if you've never heard of a Petrarchan sonnet, it's made its way into your language and your idioms without you even realizing it. And in this kind of sonnet, you compare each of the woman's characteristics, like her eyes or her skin or her hair, to some natural phenomenon and talk about how beautiful it is. But in this passage, he does none of that. He throws all of it away, and he does something completely different, and yet arguably more powerful than what Petrarch does in his sonnets describing the physical beauty of a woman. He's describing her beauty in a completely different way. And what this passage is teaching us is that what you leave out is as powerful as what you put in. So in this passage, you can't actually see Ligeia at all. She's completely covered in a way. And yet what you understand of her beauty is much greater than a physical description would allow. And the reason for this is that because there is no specific physical description, everyone projects their own ideal version of beauty onto this character, and she becomes the ideal beauty in the Platonic sense of the word ideal, instead of any particular beauty. If you imagine that he had described her with blonde hair or black hair or with green eyes or brown eyes, you would have a specific kind of picture in your mind that might not be your ideal. But because he's avoided those specific descriptions, the protagonist the reader imagines his or her ideal version of female beauty. And that's the power of omitting things strategically. So what body parts do we actually see of Ligeia? Here are some lines. We see an incomprehensible lightness and elasticity of her footfall. So we don't actually see her feet or anything like that. We see her footfall, so the grace in the way that she walks. She placed her marble hand on my shoulder. So it's not really her hand, which is beautiful, that he's describing. It's the feeling of her hand on his shoulder. He's talking about the clear music of her low, sweet voice. So he's not describing something physical again. It's a voice, which is something you can't touch, something you can't capture in a picture. Her face is described using this metaphor, the radiance of an opium dream. I love this metaphor because it's so interesting and powerful, and I rarely see it anywhere else. And it also focuses on the protagonist's reaction rather than what she literally looked like, because an opium dream is something that someone who has smoked the opium would experience. So he is seeing the world through that lens. So her beauty has made him high, as if he had smoked opium, and now the whole world is distorted around her. If he had described her as her face had the radiance of the sun, or her face was radiant like the sun. How do you think the vibe around Ligeia would change? How do you think the connotation of the sentence would change if it was the radiance of the sun rather than the radiance of an opium dream? Okay, let me read this. Bright, innocent would be more angelic, not intoxicating enough. That's a great one. Bright and positive. I like the word innocent as well. Vivid. So the sun makes things clear and makes, and is usually, sunlight is used as a metaphor for truth for this reason. So things that are clear, truthful, innocent, easy to understand. The sun is clarifying. Catherine wrote, she's more like a dark angel than an angel. Something that feels like a trap. Yeah, there's something dark about Ligeia because he's describing her this way. And I think that you should really read this story because she's a very interesting female heroine. You know, pun intended, heroine. She's a heroine in every sense of the word. And opium is definitely not clarifying. Someone named Nico wrote this. Opium is something that intoxicates you, alters your perception of reality, changes what you see, and sometimes leads to your demise. So her face is the radiance of an opium dream. Her beauty is something that may lead you down the wrong path, that may make you do things that you shouldn't be doing, distracts you from reality. And so that's why the connotation of the words that you use, the exact metaphor that you use has implications for your story itself. So even though both metaphors are beautiful, her face was radiant like the sun, or the radiance of an opium dream, they have different narrative consequences for the story itself. So that's why you have to be very careful about which metaphor you use. As with any power that you have to be careful how you use it, so that it actually serves your purpose rather than contradicts it. And also the marble is a clever way to say she is white, but marble is heavy and cold and expensive. Very different than if he used cotton. Yeah. So her footfall is light, but her hand is marble. It's heavy. She has a hold over him. So that's how these metaphors have a huge influence. And Poe describes her, what she is not describes her more than what she is. Yet her features were not of that regular mold which we have been falsely taught to worship in the classical labors of the heathen. So if you were trying to imagine her as a beautiful Greek statue, she doesn't look like that. And so then you're kind of grasping at straws, trying to figure out what she looks like. And it makes you even more curious to see her face. Why is fantasy spelled that way? I'm not really sure. I think it might have been just something to do with being in 1809. Her eyes were far larger than the ordinary eyes of our own race. So now, not only is she a strange woman, she is a woman who is not even maybe from Earth. She's from somewhere else, or she's of a different race. And this makes her more like either a fairy or an evil fairy or something like that. The beauty of beings either above or apart from the earth, the beauty of the Huri of the Turk. So to give you some background, the Huri of the Turk, it's in Islamic theology. The Huri are women who live in heaven, and they're made of saffron. They're kind of like fairies, I guess, and they're frozen at the age of 32. And they are more beautiful than any woman that exists on earth. So he's comparing her to the beauty of the Huri of the Turk. So there's something about her that doesn't belong on earth at all. And if you read the short story, you'll understand why he describes her in this way and what the impact of that is, because Ligeia is not good. She's not evil. She's something more interesting beyond those things. So the shadow beauty, creating an inhuman beauty by never looking directly at her. So it's like describing, you can't look at the sun, you have to look at things around it to understand it. And that makes you more interested and intrigued in what it actually could be. An untouched woman, innocent more than anyone, divine. Someone wrote about Romanticism, the era. Yes, so if you want to learn more about that, that's what the movement is called. we go. So here's a summary of all of the things that we've learned from Poe's passages. So passage 1 taught us that objective reality is invaded and colored by personal perception. Passage 2, we learned how using descriptions can manipulate a reader's senses. Passage 3, we learned how creating an alter ego can increase the suspense. In passage 4, we learned how unveiling the plot like a crime scene can engage the reader by making him the detective. And passage 5, we learned how omitting details can be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than leaving them in. Yes, Poe was first in other cultures. I want you to remember that the education system was not always terrible like it is today. People used to be educated about multiple cultures, history, literature, art, science. They weren't just put into one box that if you were a science student, you only studied science. If you're an arts person, you only studied art. People drew their knowledge from everywhere. And this idea that you could only be an expert in one area did not exist. An intellectual or a scholar had to know a bit about everything. And it was deemed, and it is possible to do this, because once you have the models of learning and understanding concepts about the world, learning a new subject is not an impossible or difficult feat, because all you have to do is take the new concepts and fit them into the models of reality that you've already created and understood. So Poe, like every other scholar at this time period, was actually versed in every subject. That was classical education. In fact, scientists in this time period were also very well versed in the arts and humanities as well. And that's why they were able to make so many discoveries and write so many interesting things.
Even the prostitutes were educated.
Yeah, I'm sure they were.
If you think about the concubines in like court and stuff, they could play instruments, they knew many languages, advised the nobles and things like that.
So that concludes all our passages. Do you have any? I would love to hear which one was your favorite passage or favorite line from today's lesson, and you can put it in the chat or you can say it. Also, if you have any questions about what we've learned today. So Afshin liked the one with the teeth. Why did you like that one? Number 4, the teeth one was very powerful. Catherine, do you want to share?
Hello there. Yes, I love Edgar Allan Poe. That's the main reason why I woke up at 8 a.m. in the morning here to come here. He's really amazing, and to me, all the relation with the opium and the word gloom that appears twice in the passages, the whole atmosphere. I cannot choose a particular thing. It's just the whole way of writing and so many things that maybe you forget when you stop studying or reading, and that they are so basic to, it's all about the atmosphere really, more than what is the character doing. And I think that can be extrapolated to other writers also from this movement and in general. So to me, I would recommend The Grave as one of my favorite tales from him. I had the great idea to read it out loud once in my house alone, and I can tell you, it brings the whole.
Don't read these stories to little kids. Thank you for sharing, Catherine. Someone wrote, it was powerful and more picturesque. I could see everything in my head. Opium analogies hit different. I think we should all start calling it opium instead of like crack or anything like that. It just sounds more romantic. At least if you're destroying yourself, it should be romantic.
It's a little bit more classy kind of drug.
Yeah, it's a little bit more classy. Your definition of horror was one of the best takeaway. I had never really looked at that definition. Yeah. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to share or any questions?
So Afshin, you said it was so powerful and more picturesque. I could see everything in my head. Afshin is a copywriter. So for all of the copywriters watching, how does this lesson apply to what you're going to do in your work? Number 1 is show, don't tell. Most of the time when you're a novice copywriter or you're just starting out, you default to telling as opposed to showing. And the passages that we went through now, you can see the difference. And even Megha gave you examples of telling versus showing. So when you're writing, show, don't tell, because that allows the reader to feel what you want them to feel and think what you want them to think without you imposing it on them. And your ability to invoke their imagination is the most powerful selling mechanism that you have, because they'll only read your ad once, but their imagination runs 24/7. So this is not a copywriting lesson, but you can synthesize a lot of what's gone on here to the work that you're doing, as opposed to just very basically just ABC going from one step to the next and telling them what to think and what to feel. You can use these metaphors and use these vivid descriptions of the world around you, or their world, the customer's world, to get them to actually feel the things that you want them to feel, which eventually gets them to buy. And that's sort of a very cynical kind of way to think about things. Once you become a marketer, you just become a very, very cynical person, and your job is essentially manipulating people for a living. So this is how to do that very well.
And also, I would like to say, like, just ask yourself the question, is it more fun to read a textbook, or is it more fun to read a short story? Of course, the second one. So why would you write like you're writing a textbook? No one would want to read that. So
go ahead, Catherine. You can unmute yourself.
Oh, I thought it wasn't raised, but I just remember is that Lygia's description, the way he describes, it's so refreshing, because in last modern
you cut out
and this and that, and it's like, oh, please find other ways to say the same damn thing. We know she's beautiful, we know he's handsome. Like I can recall, for example, Jules Verne saying like his eyes were intelligent, and it's not only the beauty of his physical eyes, it's the beauty of his mind and soul that you can see through his eyes and all these things. And I'm so tired of the new romantic books. It's always the same thing, and oh, this was so good to read, like looking for something like that, like other ways
to say things, getting away from the cliches. Definitely.
There's also I get what she's saying. So like, even if you're writing romance or erotica, there's a way to say things. Like if you think about the sex scene of today versus the sex scene of, like, even on TV and movies versus the sex scene of like 20-30 years ago, there's a very different way that they would portray it, either on screen or on the page. And
yes,
it's just a little bit more classy.
And it's classy. What the difference between, if you think about the definition of the word vulgar, vulgar is when you say things too directly, when you're too upfront about it. And that, that coincides with dorkiness as well, when you don't have social skills. So a vulgar person would say, like, do you want to sleep with me? That's their flirting. But then a romantic scene, what he's saying the same thing, but he's saying it in such a different way. It's implied under the surface. That's what makes it romantic. And I think the reason why vulgarity offends us so much is because it says things out loud too plainly that are too important to say that way. And this is why these new age books don't weigh on you after you finish it, but reading a classic keeps your mind going back to it even after a few days. Yes. And with that thought, I will share that there's more lessons like this in my book, Write Like a Human, Lessons on Writing from Great Literature. So we've covered a lot of what's included in chapter 1 on Edgar Allan Poe, but there's stuff we can learn from Antoine Saint-Exupéry about adventure writing, things we can learn from J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis about essay writing and how to explain an idea. If you think that essay writing has also gone really downhill with what I call the phone book manual version of essays that we see today, and the way that C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien add magic to their essays is something that you can definitely learn from. There's a chapter on Dostoevsky and writing humanity that will show you how he writes characters and their inner worlds. There's Don Quixote, which is by Miguel de Cervantes, and The Philosopher Knight. and how he writes, Frances Hodgson Burnett and her writing on pathetic fallacy. So I've included only 6 writers, but these 6 writers have written some great works of literature, and you can learn so much from all of them. So this is a 101-page guide that's very similar to the lecture that we did today, but covering 6 amazing writers. And if you just spend 2 hours on each of these within 6 weeks, you can learn the distilled lessons from these great works of literature without having to spend the time to read each of these novels or classic books. And in fact, if you are interested in any of these books afterwards, you can be inspired to read them and go in with a new perspective and an idea of what you can actually gain from reading these books. So I hope that if you want to learn more, you know that there's resources for that. And I want to thank everyone for listening and for your participation. And I want to thank Nabil for giving me the opportunity to teach today.
My pleasure. You delivered. All right, so we've got a couple minutes more. If anybody has any last minute questions, I know there was a question from Nico saying, let's say you need to sell a whiskey that's strong and has a smoky aroma. How could you use these devices to write a description? I would say, Nico, are you actually trying to sell a whiskey, or is this like a hypothetical? Because if you're not actually trying to sell one, then it doesn't make any sense to answer this question. And number 2, you're gonna have to, as a copywriter, you're gonna have to figure out ways to synthesize what you learned. There's not gonna be always a one-to-one correlation between how you use things. So how do you use emotion? How do you use metaphor to describe the taste of a whiskey? I mean, you could use any of the mechanisms that Megha described. It's just a matter of, one, using your own imagination to come up with interesting ways to say things, and 2, practice, because you're going to get better with practice. So how do we access? What I'm going to do is, let me just real quick. I'm going to drop the link in the chat, so those of you who can buy it, because I know I said this is a free lecture, but Megha spent quite a lot of time putting this very informative educational lecture together, and that's the link to buy it. I just bought my copy.
Someone asked the question, as a writer, do you think it's beneficial to study contemporary best-selling authors like James Patterson? I don't know. Some contemporary authors are really good, like Haruki Murakami is amazing. I also am a big fan of Tom Robbins, not Tony Robbins, Tom Robbins. He wrote the book Skinny Legs and All. I also really like Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. They're all great writers. It's just that it takes a bit more effort to find these great contemporary writers, whereas the classics, the work is done for you because only the best ones are the ones that have survived, and the crappy ones have already been filtered out. So I would say stick to the classics for safety, but there are definitely a lot of incredible contemporary writers, and you'll be surprised to find that a lot of the best contemporary writers are on Substack and not on your bookshelves in the normal bookstores.
Another good one is Lee Child, the guy who wrote the Jack Reacher series. He comes up a lot, along with Neil Gaiman, and who was the other one that you mentioned, Megha?
Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett.
There are a lot of great writers. And I would say the best way to find good writers is to go into a used bookstore, pull out books at random, open them to a random page and just start reading and see if you're hooked, and just take one book home and finish it. Anyway, 9 more messages. Okay. Thank you.
I think we're good to go. Thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate it. And then what I'll do is I'm gonna send you guys the recording because you were diligent enough and disciplined enough to show up live. So I'll send you the recording. And then for Megha's people, Megha's gonna get the recording anyway, so she'll probably upload it to wherever she uploads her stuff. All right. Thank you so much, Megha. And we'll probably talk later, but thank you everyone for coming, and we're going to sign off.